The French artist Jacques Joseph Tissot became one of the most successful painters in London during the 1870s, in a cultural climate very much dominated by the aesthetic movement. He is best known for a variety of pictures that portray contemporary high society, produced at this time when he was living in London. His subject matter focused on the people, and in particular on women's fashion in Victorian England. In his late teens, he began using the given name of James as an anglicisation in keeping with his increasing interest in everything English. Although already a respected painter, in 1871 he moved to London, where he found further success as an artist. Tissot arrived with established social and artistic connections in London, having already worked as a caricaturist for Thomas Gibson Bowles, the owner of the magazine Vanity Fair. Initially, he focused on portrait commissions, but quickly developed his reputation as a painter of elegantly dressed women, shown in scenes of fashionable life. His paintings appealed greatly to wealthy British industrialists throughout the later decades of the 19th century. His clients were attracted by his meticulous technique and an excellent sense of colour and compositional balance, with observation of contemporary people and places. In the thriving English picture market of the 1870s, his pictures were hugely attractive to Victorian collectors of modern art, and Tissot found no problem in selling his works as soon as they were finished. In the present-day art market, and in various museums and art gallery collections, his detailed depictions of the glamorous society of late Victorian England still retain the ability to impress and inform the viewer.
We can see he's good looking, isn't he? A very good self-portrait of him here with his birth and death dates. And he becomes really famous during a period in exile from 1871 to 1882 when he's living in London. Okay, so I think you'll agree that James Jacques Joseph Tissot was quite a handsome character. And he appears to have chosen to take an English name from quite an early age. We know that he arrives in Paris at the tender age of 17 and falls in with a group of Englishmen abroad who are often referred to as the Paris Gang. They included James McNeill Whistler. So he was in Paris in the late 1850s. As you'll see in a minute, they are all born in a very sort of like close-knit couple of years, around 1834 and 1836. So it's quite interesting to see what sort of culture that Tissot was working in. And he's got, like Whistler, he's got half a foot in Paris and half a foot in London, though it's more clearly defined. So he's working in Paris up to the Franco-Prussian War. Then he exiled to London because of the war, and he stays in London from 1871 to 1882. And the reason that he goes back to Paris is the death of his mistress or lover, the rather beautiful Kathleen Newton, who you see here, who was only 28 when she died of tuberculosis, although there is now, I think the word is gossip really, that she actually committed suicide, largely because she couldn't bear to see Tissot suffering as her own health failed. I'm not sure whether that's gilding the lily in terms of this really tragic story. But Mrs. Newton was essentially persona non grata in the Victorian world. She was divorced. Her firstborn was not the progeny of her husband. So if you're looking for a scarlet woman, this is the one to go for. I would also like to point out, as this is a close-up of a work that you'll see later, that she was a very modern woman. You can see that she's wearing eyeliner and makeup, which sort of puts her in a completely different category, if I can put it that way, to what was deemed to be respectable middle-class behaviour. So Mrs. Newton is really, there's not the victim, though you could see it that way, but certainly is the reason why Tissot leaves London and returns to France in 1882. He simply cannot bear to be without Kathleen Newton. So the first part here is just to put him into his Parisian context, because we're talking here about the emergence of realism and the early years of French Impressionism. So this is a portrait by Edouard Manet of Émile Zola. What I want you to look at here in particular are the objects in the background. We have a print by either Hiroshige or Hokusai. Next to that, we have a painting known as The Toppers by Velasquez, and below that, the infamous Olympia by Edouard Manet himself. And Zola was famous for writing, well, really rather scandalous novels like Nana, which was all about the life of a courtesan. And of course, like most tragic novels, it ends, I'm afraid, with Nana's death. You can also see a Japanese screen on the right-hand side. So Japanism will definitely be one of the elements that binds all of these artists together. So the portrait of Tissot in his studio, 1867 in date, is also full, as you can see, of Japanese references. There's a very large painting above his head, which is probably actually by Tissot, but it's all of late geishas engaged in some sort of activity. And there's also some sort of textile here on the left-hand side. So all of Tissot's generation, growing up in the 1850s, were going to be pretty addicted to all things Japanese. Now, just to remind you, Japan had been cut off from the West, and then the Americans go in with their gunships, 1852-53. And Japan is opened up to the West for the first time. And for many its artists, it's a revelation. So it's, again, useful just to see the world, Tissot's world. So we know, as I say, he's born in Nantes, which may account for his passion for ships. He has a very supportive mother, but his father, who is a draper, is dead against him going into the profession of artist.
But his mother was much more supportive, and with letters of introduction, we find the young Tissot, aged only 17, studying at the Academy in Paris. However, he wasn't very fond of formal art education. He much preferred the ambience of the ateliers, which were much more like workshops. Here you would work directly alongside not only the master, but also your young contemporaries. We understand that he met Whistler, however, in the Louvre, having asked permission to copy paintings. Many young artists made a living simply by copying masterpieces for sale.
You notice alarmingly now how they all have very similar birthdays. So Degas and Whistler and William Morris are all born in the same year, 1834, as is Christopher Dresser. It's rather alarming, isn't it? Then down the bottom, only 2 years older, is Edouard Manet, and they're all in this little tight-knit group. Tissot would have learnt about and met Alma Tadema quite early on in his career, because we know that in 59 he goes to Antwerp. He wants to study under the Belgian historicist artist Hendrik Leys, who was Alma Tadema's master. At this stage, he's just Lorenz Tadema. He puts the Alma in and hyphenates it to move him up the register. He didn't like being so far down. The one thing that you can say about Tadema was he was very good at self-promotion. And I know some people want to pronounce it Tadema, but he's Dutch. So I am going for the more straightforward Alma Tadema. And we also have a famous Royal Academy little limerick. He was Alma Tad of the Royal Acad. So there we are. And this is, he's quite young, as you can see in this portrait of Alma Tadema. He's of the same, as you can see, generation. He's born in 1836. So that might have just interested you, the fact that you could also like interconnect them. I'm going to go through these quite quickly, but this is the sort of thing that the young Tissot paints, very much in the style of Baron Lees, in fact. This is the departure of the prodigal sons. It's the famous biblical story, but it's been set in the style of Carpaccio, the famous Renaissance Venetian artist. We have a lovely view of Venice in the background, and in the foreground we have the prodigal son leaving. Here's a nice close-up of that central group, and you can see that it's painted in an almost pre-Raphaelite style, isn't it? And remembering that this is painted, in the 1860s, and pre-Raphaelitism was pretty well known across the continent, in fact, by the late 50s. So this is him leaving, and this is him returning. Now, the interesting thing here is he's leaving in the Southern Renaissance, and he's returning in the Northern Renaissance. This pair of paintings, they're both in the Petit Palais in Paris. So now the prodigal son has returned to somewhere Flemish. I'm just going to show you some close-ups. So here in the centre is the prodigal son, who clearly has not gone and found fame and fortune. I've got some wonderful images here where you can see typical pre-Raphaelite realism, attention to detail, accurate costumes, bravado painting. What amazes me is how many paintings Tissot can paint in a relatively short period at this level of detail and meticulous archaeological correctness in terms of their costume. I love this guy because I just love his stripy trousers. And the lady in the background appears to be holding a very large loaf of bread. So that's how he starts out. So he starts off like Alma Tadema does, in fact, in the medieval period. But then we know that he is invited to exhibit at the 1862 exhibition. So this was 11 years on from the Great Exhibition of 1851. So that's the building in Hyde Park, obviously no longer with us. But this was the first time that Japanese goods were shown in the West at an international exhibition. We don't know as much about it as we would like to. There is the image from the Illustrated London News showing you what was on display. And it wasn't an official display. It was the collection of Sir Rutherford Alcock, who had been our consul in Edo, which is the original name for Tokyo. We know that the V&A bought quite a few things, like the rather beautiful jardiniere at the top with the waves and the cranes, because it was all too easy for designers simply to copy anything Japanese or Chinese. And we think that we know that he would have seen works by John Everett Millais because they were on display in 1862. And we know that Tissot was actually present at the exhibition. I can't actually prove that he met Millais, but I think that he was very well aware because I can show you the similarities. So this is apple blossoms in the Lady Lever Art Gallery. It's painted, just before the international exhibition. It shows his sisters-in-law for the most part. These are all the sisters of Effie, who has now got her divorce from Ruskin and is married to John Everett Millais and will go on to have 8 children of her own. It's very beautiful, isn't it? There's a symbolist element because if you look on the right-hand side, there's a young girl lying on the ground. That's always a bad sign. That means that she's a wanton, fallen woman, literally. And above our fallen woman is a scythe. Ladies, you've been warned. And you can see here Tissot's Spring of 1865 is very, very similar. And they say that his interest in fashion probably comes from his, roots with his mother and his father. His mother designed hats and his father ran a drapery store. So he would have been brought up, in fact, with an interest in fashion. So one of the ways in which Tissot infuriated people was the direct way in which his figures looked out of the canvas, like the young lady here. This seems to have broken British decorum, because a nice lady would not look directly at the spectator. And I don't think that's a camera on the ground, though it would be lovely if it was, because photography will play a very large part in the way that Tissot conceives his complex compositions. So this was exhibited at the Salon in Paris in 1869. This is The Widow, and it's typical really of the emergence of what becomes known as the problem picture. It was a problem to Victorian audiences, as they weren't 100% certain how to actually read the image. It was all really rather ambiguous. We have almost here the 3 ages of woman. We have the rather bored child who is likely to grow up and be expected to make a good marriage. We have the young widow who's obviously been widowed far too early in life, and then the only thing to look forward to in the future is reading a book. So you've got youth, maturity, and then old age. You often need to look in the background for clues Like, for instance, there's lots of things on the tea table. So are they outside or are they expecting a visitor? And the other clue, of course, is the sculpture, which appears to be some sort of classical illusion. They're holding a bow and an arrow. So is that like Cupid's dart? You're not 100% certain with Tissot, and that was what makes him so, I think, appealing today, but got him into a bit of trouble with his audience at the time. And then on the portrait of Mademoiselle LL, that's not me not knowing her name, it's we really don't know her name, but he would have used an image like this to try and get commissions for portraits, because portraiture was really how you made your bread and butter in the 19th century. But I want you to notice things like the use of mirrors. That probably comes from the Pre-Raphaelites. And again, this interest in fashion. And she's wearing the very latest Spanish bolero. Everybody was mad on Spanish art in the mid-19th century. There was even a Spanish gallery in Paris. Hence, we've seen already Manet's interest in Velasquez. So his big breakthrough comes with portraiture. This is now in the Musée d'Orsay. So if you see Orsay, that's what I'm referring to. And this is the Marquess and Marchioness of Miramon and their children. And you can see what I mean about almost photographic veracity, particularly in the case of her dress. And it was painting this relatively standard, but it's a bit of a Hogarthian conversation piece going on here. I do love the way they've brought their Louis XV furniture with them in the corner. But it's this that got him an even bigger commission to paint the circle of the Rue Royale. And it was through such commissions that he starts to make his name and his fortune. And as you're about to discover, he's going to be able to move in the late 1860s to one of the most prestigious parts of Paris. So here are the Circle of the Rue Royale was a very exclusive private club, founded in 1852. I haven't gone through the detail of picking out who all the figures are, because they're not well known in our history compared to France. But the important thing is that each one paid Tissot 1,000 francs to be included in the painting. And then they sort of drew lots at the end as to who would own it. And it was Baron Hottinger, who is seated to the right of the sofa. That's this character here, who actually took the painting home. The Prince de Polignac, I'm not actually quite sure which one he is, I think it might be him down here, was one of the great patrons of the arts of his day. So this gives you sort of the character of the club. It was very much a gentleman's club. It wasn't just new trade, it was aristocrats, and it was aristocrats interested in the arts. So I mentioned that he's able to leave the relatively poor, not poor in that sense, but he's able to leave the left bank, which was seen to be, not such a prestigious address, the Rue Bonaparte, and he moves to this brand new road. Now it's the Avenue Foch. It was the Rue of the Empress. It's sort of in that Étoile area, Place de l'Étoile, I mean, the star-shaped square, all the roads coming in, the new boulevards, wide and leafy, and the Empress led out to the Bois de Boulogne. So he was in a sort of relatively rural area of Paris, which was newly developed, under Haussmann's strategy. And we're here on the staircase, so we can start to play Chase the Dress. So you see this white house coat, but what I'm also wanting you to look at is that she's looking through the window, beautiful stained glass window, towards one of the interiors, which is brimming, as you can see, with beautiful 18th century antiques. And on the mantelpiece, I'll point it out for you here, lots of bits of blue and white china. Melancholy has recently gone through the sale room, and it's the same dress. So right from a very early stage, we can play Chase the Dress. So La Cheminée is said to be in this new exclusive house that he has now acquired on the Empress Avenue. I'm showing you here a luncheon, because it's the same dress. So here, you'll find that the dresses move from one to the other painting. So they're obviously all in his studio. He's playing with you, in other words. And this phase is known as the directoire phase. So he's sort of painting French history from about 1790 to the early Napoleonic period, about 1805. Rather interestingly, you can see a port scene in the background here, and a bit of, and he's got his bags with him. So he's obviously come to say goodbye before he goes sailing off, and there's a bit of flirtation, as you can see, going on. You wouldn't show your ankles like that in London. And then the same dress, but what I really want you to notice is that weird thing there on the mantelpiece, or the pug will follow us around as well. So keep your eyes on the pug. So the most important thing is that weird thing on the mantelpiece. So I just quickly go back. It's up here. I've got a little red thing around it, but we don't actually know what it is, apart from the fact that it's really ugly. It's ugly and it's Japanese. So most importantly, you know, he was really committed to this new vogue for Japanism. We know that he was present at the International Exhibition held in Paris in 1867. This is the so-called Satsuma Pavilion down the bottom. This is the 14-year-old Prince Tokugawa, who was the official representation for the legation. And he is painted by Tissot. This is, by the way, in the Imperial Palace in Japan. And so this image of the prince is painted by Tissot, who was appointed his drawing master. So when we say that there are close connections between Tissot and Japan, we are not exaggerating. So he produces a whole series of paintings in Paris that all relate to this new vogue for Japanism. This one's got goldfish, and it always reminds me of being in an auction house. I'm showing on the left-hand side a monochrome and a piece of Kangxi blue and white. I'll just quickly explain what Kangxi is. So they loved Kangxi Chinese porcelains. They are late 17th century, early 18th century, sort of around about 1680 to 1720 or thereabouts. I always forget the exact dates for Kangxi, but Kangxi was, you know, essentially the one was very highly regarded because it was the perfect color blue. Okay, so they had a bit of obsession with the color blue. This is even more unusual, the one on the left-hand side, the Japanese bather, where we see her in a very loose-fitting kimono. They're not really Japanese ladies, but they're not really quite European, are they? They are quite exotic in the way that he presents them. And you've got references to blue and white again in the background. And then related to these two very overt Japanese, in the sense that they are wearing Japanese costume, we have a whole series, we have 3 paintings that are all about pretty women looking at Japanese objects. So this is the first one that I'm going to show you. This is in a private collection. You can see here they're looking at things in the case. There's a piece of cloisonne or porcelain here and a screen behind with, you know, geishas and kimonos. This one's, they all got the same titles. Young ladies looking at Japanese articles. They're looking at a very elaborate bird cage here. We know that all these objects were actually in Tissot's own home. So it's giving you an idea of the exotica of the Victorian studio. There's our blue and white. I'm giving you a close-up of it and the rather beautiful kimono in the background, very similar to the one that the lady was wearing, the Japanese bather. And this is a shrine in the background. To compare to Tissot, you're going to pick on Alfred Stevens, who is Flemish, despite that very English-sounding name. Tissot was bound to be painting very similar subjects to Alfred Stevens because they are both Japanophiles. They both collected, and you can see here this link between beautiful women and exotic objects. So in the beautiful blue dress, which is in the Clark Institute in America, we've got, again, a screen and textiles, and that looks more like a piece of 18th century Sèvres, to be perfectly honest. But the important thing is she's surrounded with beautiful objects. And India in Paris, as the name suggests, is this idea that women are attracted to bizarre, unusual curiosities. So in the howdah, there's a little tiny Japanese or Chinese, but probably likely to be Chinese doll either. It doesn't really matter. They collate the two together. But you get a lot of images of women and their dolls, which has, again, a sort of underlining symbolism. You know, the woman is a bit of a doll in a gilded cage, and she's playing with her dolls in the gilded cage. So if we've met the Miramont family already, we've met the group portrait. Now we're looking at just a portrait of the Marquise, which is in the Getty. Now, this is always said to be in their own home, a rather beautiful, typical 18th century palatial manor house. But I have my doubts. And my reason for having my doubts is twofold. One is she's wearing, I know she's wearing a weird sort of like a game house coat, but do you wear gloves indoors in your own home? I'm not sure. It's very odd. There is the screen, there's the textile, but there's that strange object again, this stylized carp, very popular Japanese motif on the mantelpiece. So I'm not 100% certain that it is. It could still actually be in Tissot's own studio. And she's positioned in front of a bust of Marie Antoinette. Again, read into that what you will. And this is the important thing with Tissot. It's sort of reading into the image and realizing that the selection of objects is not random, that they are teasing you and playing a sort of subtext that you can either take or leave. So the last of my sequence of young ladies looking at Japanese objects is this one. This is a piece that Tissot owned, and later on in the early 1880s, he's going to experiment making cloisonné. So this is actually decorated with Mrs. Newton and her family, more of them in a minute, but you can see it's the same shape. And around about 1880, 1882, that he starts to expand from painting into the decorative arts, and he makes quite a few of these cloisonné pieces, none of which, by the way, sell. But remarkably, there is an example of Tissot's cloisonné in the collection in Brighton. You can see it better here. So we know that it was based on a series of paintings inspired by Tissot's garden in St John's Wood, which you'll see in a minute. So Summer and Children in the Garden and Mrs Newton with a parasol are all transcribed on the vase. And I've no idea what he intended to do with this. Appears to be related to Paris 1878. It's a fountain to represent fortune, which is a tortoise, as you can see, with a globe and a snake and a winged victory on the top. And I'm not quite sure what he intended this to be used for, but the important thing is you can see him moving into the decorative arts, which was, of course, typical. It's what Morris inspired artists to do, to sort of expand their horizons and to imagine a unity of the arts. So this is still in the Directoire period, but we're now on the cusp of Tissot moving to London. Please note the pug. I hope he brought his pug with him. We saw it earlier in front of the fireplace. And you can recognize these paintings because of the wonderful hats women wear in these Directoire period paintings. Again, look at the way she's looking at you directly, just like Manet's Olympia. And that, of course, was not the English way. When he moves to London, because he flees in 1871 from the Commune in Paris, leaving, I think he brings his paintings, but very little else when he flees. He makes his living working for Vanity Fair as a portraitist rather than a caricaturist, as you'll see in a minute. And the earliest images that we have are on the River Thames. So on the Thames, a heron is again showing you that debt to Japan, and that's in Minneapolis. And then also on the Thames, a picnic at Nunham Courtney. Well, you'll see that dress quite a few times. So he may have been able to bring some of his costumes with him, but he has a stock of costumes and they just constantly reappear in the paintings, again irritating on his English audience. So this is the rather dashing, I think I'll agree, Frederick Gustavus Burnaby. A bit of a ladies' man, as well as a dashing officer, as you can see, cavalry officer. But he was one of the backers of Vanity Fair, this new society magazine. This is often described as his last Paris picture and his first English picture, because it was commissioned in Paris, but completed in London. So say he looks very chic. And this is the sort of thing that he was producing for Vanity Fair. Okay, so this is Thomas Gibson Bowles. So Burnaby basically helped Bowles, who's the money man, launch Vanity Fair. And it's called Vanity Fair. But in fact, Bowles suggests the name from Thackeray's novel. So it gives you an idea of character, really, of Vanity Fair. As you'll see, he was working in a very similar genre to Spy. So Spy, this is the pseudonym of Leslie Ward, one of Vanity Fair's most famous. Well, they're not quite caricatures, are they? They sort of emphasize certain features, but I wouldn't call them vicious caricatures. And the images by Spy are known as Men of the Day. Tissot's first celebrity caricature was of European royalty, okay, couldn't resist it, because of course it's Napoleon III, who is about to fall from grace. And you can see this relationship begins even before he's left for London in 1869. And this was his nom de plume, Cody. So I thought you'd find these funny. This is Leopold, King of the Belgians, holding all of his money from the Congo. So that's Garibaldi. I love him with his moustache. This is King Cole, as in Henry Cole. So he's, of course, the South Kensington system. And I love Darwin. And if you read down the bottom again, you can see the snide comment, King Cole, because he was so powerful, and Darwin, natural selection. It's rather alarming, really, isn't it? And then these two you might be familiar with. Well, I'm certainly familiar with the one of Lord Leighton. Again, it reminds you of the world he's moving in the 1870s in London. But what comes as a bit of a shock is that's a portrait of Charles Voysey. That's the father of the famous architect, C.F.A. Voysey. So he was also a man of the day. And as you can see from the quote, I have much to be thankful for. Algernon Moses Marsden, equally dashing and currently on loan from a private collection at the Ashmolean. He looks dashing, but evidently he was a bit of a cad. He, like many dealers, he was a bit dubious, not to be 100% trusted. He'll be declared bankrupt 3 times and eventually die in exile in America, escaping his creditors. You see him here at the peak of his good looks, and we thought that this was in his home, but we now know that it was in Tissot's London home. You can identify it by that vase and that rather magnificent tiger skin. So it was through dealers like Marsden and Agnew's, the famous Agnew's of London, and auctioning works through Christie's, and not Sotheby's. Sotheby's weren't into fine art at this stage. They were largely books, but Christie's was. So he works the markets when he arrives in London. So this is one of his last Paris subject pictures. It's called The Foursome, so you can work out what's going on there. Please note that dress. It's travelled now already across at least 3 paintings. But he brings his directoire period to London. So when he first starts to paint in London, this is his chosen era. So this is in the National Museum of Wales in the directoire period. I mean that, it's painted, it's supposed to be between 1790 and about 1810. He's supposed to be going off to war, as you can see. They're in their boat down there. Hence the title, Bad News or the Parting. And I love the way they're sitting on a Rossetti chair. Well, he is. Yes, they're Rossetti chairs. Okay, links to William Morris all the time. But he liked that motif of making the tea so much, he reprised it on its own. So here is our elegant directoire lady. I'm not sure that's London in the background. I think that's Portsmouth. You'll see why I say that in a minute. But again, it's incredibly beautifully painted, isn't it, in terms of its detailing. So his early successes at the Royal Academy were paintings of faux pas. Obviously, as an outsider, he was able to examine London society and pick holes in it. So this is too early. It's about arriving too early. Ruskin hated these paintings and described them inevitably as unhappy, mere coloured photographs of vulgar society. You can see already that he plays with you because the same dresses appear in the same painting. That pink one will pop up all the way through. And I've got a close-up of the gentleman in the centre who is realising his faux pas. He has arrived too early and is surrounded by rather charming ladies. And here's a sort of wonderful conversation, not quite going on, between the lady behind the fan and the rather louche character leaning against the wall. The main thing is you can see the same dress is coming up the stairs. So, in the 19th century, women had spies out to make sure that they did not turn up at a party wearing the same dress as one of their rivals. And so this is absolutely typical of the way that Tissot plays with you. So there's that pink dress again. And this is called Hush, because we've got all this, a group here on the staircase. Clearly one of them, she's asleep, I've just noticed, not bothered about the music at all. These are the exalted guests over here, and we're waiting for the audience to shut up, basically, so that the violinist can start. So this was the sort of thing that he really liked painting. what he saw as a social faux pas. Then there's a whole series inspired by the Port of London and Portsmouth. So the last evening, as the name suggests, we are imagining looking at the fact that he's holding the newspaper, which will have all the sailing times in it. As a little girl earwigging, as you can see, and they're presumably having some discussion about our couple over here. But they aren't really looking at each other. So again, the public found these aloof women that don't really make eye contact with anybody in the painting, but particularly the man who appears to be declaring undying love, all rather ambiguous. And the English don't like ambiguity. So this is Wapping. This is by Whistler. That's probably Jo, who was Whistler's mistress. So once you know what you're looking for, you can sort of go through the images perhaps a bit more quicker than you might otherwise, because you begin to see repetitions all the time. Repetitions of dresses, repetitions of the models. And here we've got the same couple. So he's, looking at her, same bloke, undying love. And she's sort of looking off somewhere over there. We're not quite sure what she's looking at. But again, there's sort of this ambiguity in the relationships between the figures. And it's simply entitled The Captain and the Mate, but doesn't help you at all. Boarding the Yacht has got the same character, as you can see, exactly the same ginger beard. And the young lady that he's talking to is now wearing the same dress. Yes, you see what I mean here about he's deliberately playing with you in moving these dresses from one painting to another. And so here's another figure that he uses frequently in the early 1870s. He was at the picnic at Nunham Courtney, but most importantly, there's that dress and there's that rug, or one very like it. So it's just really interesting to see. And the other thing that, again, the English wouldn't have liked was the very direct gaze of the figure out of the painting. So his masterpieces come thick and fast at this point. So the Ball on Shipboard, bought by Agnew. Agnew was one of the leading dealers of the mid-19th century and had offices in galleries in London and in Manchester. So they were supplying the new art to the new money. So we think this is the Regatta at Cowes on the Isle of Wight. They're all wearing the same, two blue, two green. He likes painting twins. Perhaps he was fascinated by Princess Alexandra. So the Prince of Wales marries her, I think, around about 1862. But Princess Alexandra often dressed identically to one of her sisters. So they were often seen about town as twins, like the couple that you see here. But there's the blue dress. Sorry, there's the blue dress. There's the pink dress. I've got some close-ups, I think. Yeah, the critics didn't like the low plunge. And this is me just showing you the pink dress coming up the steps to give you an idea of some of the really harsh criticisms at the time. So the picture lacked the smartness, which makes so many uncouth things agreeable to the eye. Not quite sure what that means, but clearly he doesn't like it. He thinks that the subject is vulgar. No pretty women, but a set of showy rather than elegant costumes. Some few graceful, but more ungraceful attitudes, he's referring to this, I think, and not a lady in a score of female figures. So that's very obvious. The girls who are spread about in every attitude are evidently the high life below stairs of the port, who have borrowed their mistresses' dresses for the nonce. They mean that by that for the event. So these are clearly not respectable women. That's the important thing. So again, just let's quickly chase the dress. So we see it here again, reprised in Reading the News. There are the twins wearing. And this is Tissot's new fantastic studio, which is in St John's Wood. So he quickly establishes his reputation and is soon coining in the money. And you can actually see she's probably standing in one of these window alcoves that you're looking at there. At least that's the supposition. So just to show you how he was quite amenable to adapting to the demands of the market, on the Thames, now in Wakefield, caused a scandal. There's the pug. He did bring it with him. This louche character here was seen to be totally inappropriate with two unchaperoned women. And even more alarmingly, he's wearing natted shoes and has taken bottles of champagne with him. Gosh, it's going to be a free-for-all, as you can see, on the Thames. Of course, it's the Pool of London we're looking at. We've now moved, however, to Portsmouth Dockyard, which you can see very clearly in the background. And this was a repainting of the same subject, but now made highly respectable. It's simply known as How Happy I Could Be With Either, and has an office, well, sergeant in fact, fraternising with two young ladies. He's obviously not sure which one to choose between, but he is nowhere near as troublesome as this rather louche character here. And there's certainly no sign of champagne, which is the important thing. This also upset Ruskin because of her derriere, which appears to sort of stick out of the painting in a rather alarming manner, emphasising her beautifully tiny waist. And there also appears to be a flirtation going on as she's hiding behind the fan. And again, we have a rather louche sailor in the background. Henry James didn't like it. Dismissed it as hard, vulgar, and banal. Yes, the dress here is really interesting because it's very distinctive, as you can see, and it's now being worn by Miss Lloyd, as she's frequently referred to. But Miss Lloyd was a very popular model, and she was used by several of the artistic fraternity. So this is Marie Lloyd in Leighton, as in Lord, twixt hope and fear of 1895. I have now discovered that his favourite model, Dorothy Dean, was actually quite successful as an actress. And in the summer of 1895, she was touring the provinces. So she was not available to model for Twixt Hope and Fear. She wasn't available to model either for his most famous painting, Flaming June. But isn't it amazing how the same model can be transformed by the artist? So I think this is a particularly salutary lesson in terms of it's the eye of the artist. This is now is in the Perez Simon collection, which is in Mexico City. Sorry about that. And then this Tissot version of Miss Lloyd, well, she never took her clothes off because she was the daughter of a bankrupt squire. And here is the dress again. So it's clearly one of Tissot's own, but it's now being worn by Miss Newton, who you'll meet in a minute. So here we are again, a little group of his problem pictures. So this again was painted twice. Once with the cigar, there's the cigar, and once without. Again, nobody liked this. They thought that it was, again, a vulgar subject. We've got tourists. One's looking at his Baedeker, but she's looking directly at you. And the discarded cigar caused a lot of consternation, as it rather implied that there was some sort of transaction that had just taken place, and that, again, Our Lady is not respectable. To make matters worse, the children are wearing Christ's Hospital school uniforms. By the way, they still wear these today. But at that time, Christ's Hospital was causing something of a bit of a ripple in the news, as in 1877, it's going to leave its London premises and move out. And there were sort of rumblings about impropriety in the public school system that appeared to have come to a head. I mean, 1877, but they appear to have been rumbling a bit before. So again, there may be undercurrents there in the choice of the boys from Christ's Hospital School. He's very clever at doing that. The letter, again, is a problem painting. So who's the letter from? She's out in the garden reading it. Is it good news? Is it bad news? It's also a wonderful setting. I think it's Holland Park. And the passing storm, again, is not just a reference to the storm outside, which is, by the way, Ramsgate, but also a reference to some sort of argument between our two protagonists. So it's rather theatrical, as you can see. And she's wearing that same dress again, isn't she? White and yellow ribbons. However, we think that this might be Mrs. Newton because she appears on the scene in sort of 76, I think, officially. But we definitely know this is Mrs. Newton. You can see now a better image of Ramsgate in the background. Room overlooking the harbour. This originally sold in 1879 as Seaside Albion Hotel, Ramsgate, for £80. If I had a time machine only. They're having breakfast, he's reading the paper, and she's actually reading a book. So the interesting thing about Mrs. Newton is when you see her in the painting, she is presented as a highly respectable Victorian woman. A Type of Beauty is the title of this one, and she definitely was that, a type of beauty. So these are just showing you how lovely she was. So this is known as Mavorine, my darling, portrait of Kathleen Newton. This is Mavorine, this one here, which is Irish. It's a song, and it basically means my darling, my beloved. And this is a winter's walk promenade in the snow, which is just fabulous. But again, that direct stare would have been taken as a negative in terms of her respectability. And then this is a type of beauty. And for many, many years, we did not know who Mrs. Newton was. And so art historians simply referred to her after this etching from 1880 as La Mystérieuse. And then somebody who remembered all of this from their youth came forward and gave her her full name, Kathleen Irene Ashburnham Newton. So she's from an Anglo-Indian family. At 17, she is engaged to a surgeon in the Indian Civil Service by the rather amusing name of Isaac Newton. She is sent by ship to her new would-be husband, but on the way, she is wooed by a cad, Captain Palliser of the Bengal Rifles. I'm afraid that on her wedding night to Isaac Newton, she admits to this liaison on the boat, and her husband immediately starts divorce proceedings. She finds herself pregnant. We assume that it is Captain Palliser's, and we find her back in London with a baby and now divorced as Mrs. Newton. We think that Tissot met her in 1875. Literally on the streets, don't take that the wrong way, but posting a letter or something like that in St. John's Wood, because she was now living with her sister. She'll give birth, so she's already got a daughter. She'll give birth to her son Cecil, which we've always debated, is this Tissot's child or not? But because she is essentially outside, an outcast of society, can't marry her because of all this baggage. They sort of live in this secluded idyll, their home, Grove End Road, originally 17, now I think 44, in St. John's Wood. And he dominates his paintings from now on. I couldn't resist showing you this one. It's not Mrs. Newton, but this is 1867. It's ours. It's in Southampton. But I chose it because remember that because she was religious and she was Roman Catholic, she made that error of actually confessing to her sins on her wedding night, and most clearly was not forgiven by her husband. So these images are just ravishing. So to the Victorian public, they didn't know the Mrs. Newton story. These were just all part of a cult of beauty, you know, alongside a Leighton or an Alma Tadema or an Albert Moore or Rossetti or any other painting of the 1870s, shown either at the Royal Academy or the Grosvenor Gallery. This is October. This one's Orphelin, which is made a world record at the time that it was sold, about 10 or 15 years ago. And a lot of these ended up with Andrew Lloyd Webber, who got a bit of a fixation for Tissot for obvious reasons. And the orphans is particularly poignant, isn't it? Now, who are the orphans? Is it both of them? Because she's very young, and Mrs. Newton was only 28 when she died. Or is it the child sucking her thumb that's the orphan? The main thing is that it's the widow and the orphan, or it's the orphans. They are not abandoned, but they are alone in the world. And then the widower, 1877, almost exactly the same date, doesn't have quite the same punch, does it, as Mrs. Newton? And it's quite interesting just to see how she, again, the same subjects. So this is Waiting for the Ferry. Please note the greatcoat. This is she wears this habitually in the paintings. Waiting for the Ferry, number 2. And that's not Tissot, but we have photographs relating to this that show that he was using photographs as an aid to his memory. So they're outside the Falcon, waiting for the ferry. The Falcon Tavern. It's on the River Thames, and they are waiting for the ferry. Yeah, sorry, it's Gravesend, the dock beside the Falcon in Gravesend. So here it's not Mrs. Newton. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, to go from, this is 1874, this is pre-Newton, this is post-Newton. I like it. But that little girl is interesting. That dress is interesting. There's the little girl there, and she pops up in a visit to the yacht of the same era, you know, the same period, 1873, looking equally bored, I think you'll agree. And that dress certainly flips around the one that the model is wearing. So here's another waiting for the ferry. And this, interestingly enough, has got the children. So this is Cecil. And we think this might actually be her niece rather than her daughter, who by 1878, 1880 would be, well, a bit older than the child that you see here. But we have a lot of fun trying to work out the children and who belongs to who. So this is the photograph, as I said, that was used to assist his memory. So we've got Kathleen and we've got James, we've got definitely her son Cecil. We're not sure that, unfortunately, if it's Tissot's, always known as Cecil Newton. And then Lillian Hervey is Newton's niece. So again, they live locally, remember. And then I need to speed up, but I want to show you some wonderful images of the house and the garden. So we know that Tissot was a great collector and supported his Parisian friends. So at one point he owned the Grand Canal at Blue Venice by Manet. That's now in the Met. There I showed you again already a view of the beautifully it's beautifully decorated interior. His architect was Bryden. And here's an image, Hide and Seek is the title, showing you his lavish interior with its carpets and its furs, its Chinese porcelain. And Mrs. Newton is reading a paper in the background. Domestic bliss. The conservatory, however, is absolutely magnificent. This was recently deaccessioned by the Met, who still have 3 Tissots. We're back to those twins, aren't they? And what is going on here in the conservatory? Rivals. To me, it's the young man that they are trying to attract his attention. I wish I had a lot more time to go through some of the details, like the Chinese vases in the background, all that sort of thing. One of the things that we can definitely pick out is his love of flowers, but his very elaborate bird cage, which moves around the painting. So, bunch of lilacs, 1877. Agnews bought it at Christie's. I wish I'd had a time machine. £346. And chrysanthemums. And the reason that I put in who bought them is, again, you can sort of really see how Tissot appealed, ironically, to the very class that he was painting. Sort of new arrivals, the sort of the faux pas that we saw created, because they don't quite know the etiquette of the upper classes. They have money, but they are rather raw or vulgar, as they were often referred to by Henry James. The Clark Institute one I love, because I just love all the chrysanthemums. You can play Chase the Teapot too. So here's the rivals. We've got a young widow here vying for the attentions of the 2 far older men. Boudoir life of luxuriously appointed villas, where graceful ladies in irreproachable costume keep a brace of rivals in play at 5 o'clock tea, plying their crochet pins as demurely as if men's affections were woman's natural playthings. Well, you've got it in a nutshell, haven't you? You know, they're showing a lot of interest and she's totally ignoring them. Please note the birdcage. It's travelled from the previous painting. And the teapot's a lot of fun. We can identify it as a Royal Worcester one. It's just there. And it pops up in a couple of his paintings, as you'll see in a minute. We're moving out now to the garden, spring morning. You can just see some of the studio in the background, and in this one you can actually see the conservatory, which makes a useful link for me. The garden is magnificent. It has this cast iron colonnade running round it. We saw that dress earlier. It was at Nunn and Courtney in the picnic. It's quite interesting how he uses these costumes over and over again. And there's obviously been some sort of tiff here, quarrelling, but we're not quite sure what. And I'm sure there's a bit of flirting going on as well. So this is a photograph of the cast iron colonnade in Tissot's garden, which is in St John's Wood. And the interesting thing about this is you'll come back here, because when Tissot leaves in 1882 to go back to Paris, Alma Tadema will move in. Okay, so it's a good link there in terms of the occupation of the studio. So is this another problem picture? The convalescent. She's wearing the same dress with the yellow ribbons. And it's clearly, I think, Mrs. Newton, though she's not yet ailing. But there's been a man here. There's his hat and his cane. So you can't help thinking that it's very much like the sort of courtesan scenario of some of Colette's novels. I'm thinking here of Gigi. In A Holy Day or The Picnic, it's the same colonnade. But please note the teapot has travelled with us. That's that Royal Worcester one that we saw in the conservatory. And they are wearing the caps of the Zingari, an elite amateur cricket club. Love it. Now, the hammock is a useful reminder to me that there is a novel about Tissot, and it's written by a lady called Lucy Pantilier. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce her name, but she has got wonderful web pages just under the title The Hammock. So if you put in The Hammock and Tissot, you'll get all of her web pages to come up. I particularly like The Hammock, and I like the way, again, I'm emphasizing here that to the public, she's this mysterious lady of fashion, and here she is in the garden with the children's toys and the dog. You know, it's this picture of domestic bliss. Full sunlight here. We've got a photograph that relates to this, but the important thing is just picking out the children. So this is Cecil, probably with his aunt, Muriel Mary Violet Newton, and two unidentified figures, which I think is, in fact, this one. I mean, I'm just making a supposition there that it's likely to be her sister. And as I said, we've got a photograph that goes with that. So we can see again the importance of photography in terms of him working out his compositions. So Tissot's quiet. We saw a close-up of this. I love the way the dog looks like he's taken the hat off. You know, it's quite amusing, that, isn't it? The relationship between the hat and the dog. And the little girl who we've seen, likely to be Lillian Harvey, she seems to sort of, again, flit through the paintings. So here they are all on the garden bench. This is the world record for a painting by Tissot, and was bought by Andrew Lloyd Webber. It made, well, with premium, there wasn't a lot of change out of 6 million for it. But of course, it was the zenith. And she's about to die tragically, either of TB or even this idea that she took her own life, because living in this secluded paradise, as she sickened, she couldn't bear the way that Tissot was mourning her, even in life. And I can emphasize that for you with the last little clutch of slides. So, yeah, this one, Summer Evening, perhaps brings over more poignantly her failing health in 1881. He's already interested in religious subjects. This is where he's going to go when he goes back to Paris. He's going to return sort of really serious subjects derived from the Bible. It's known, in fact, as Tissot's Bible, and all of it is, for the most part, in Brooklyn. But this is the prodigal son in modern times. We saw this in the medieval era when we started, but now we've got an up-to-date version of it. He has a one-man show in the Dudley Gallery in 1882. So he's at the height of his powers and his English fame when Mrs. Newton dies and he returns to Paris. So this is the prodigal son leaving. This is the study for it at Bonham's. You can perhaps see in the study that that's Mrs. Newton in the corner. This is him about to go off and find fame and fortune, which eludes him. And this is the Oriental interlude, where clearly he has been seduced by an opium den. And then this is him returning, along with the fatted calf in the background. And so in Paris, he tries to, he doesn't really reinvent himself initially. He tries to reprise his idea of the fashionable woman, but it just doesn't seem to catch on with the Parisians. I mean, we're now in the mid-1880s. Pointillism is now developing as a new technique. We've had the French Impressionists. They have their last exhibition in 1886. So I think when he gets back to Paris, he looks very old-fashioned, and he's still painting subjects which worked in the 70s but don't really work in the 80s. Plus, it wasn't so easy to get the nuances, I think, in France, in terms of old money and new money and outsiders and insiders, as it was in aesthetic movement London in the 1870s. So The Bridesmaid, which is in Leeds, glorious bustle. The Ladies of the Chariots in the Hippodrome, which was an all-iron structure like the Crystal Palace. But what they're celebrating here is the completion of the Statue of Liberty. As you know, it was created in France and then was a gift from the French Republic to the American Republic. So that's the reason for their crowns. He'll rework an older composition. So we've got The Ambitious or Political Woman, which is in Buffalo, or we'll have The Ball, that might possibly be Mrs. Newton over here. or certainly sort of, actually, sorry, that's the wrong date. It's 1881, not 1887. So that could well still be Mrs. Newton. But you can see, look, he's completely just reprised the subject, though he has updated the dress. And I love the way all the men are sort of captivated by her beauty. And it ranges right the way across women from all levels of society. So we have the young lady of the shop, and we have the ladies up from the provinces who don't quite know again what they're doing. So it's going back to some of those problems that we saw, like hush and too early right from the beginning, with again this sort of repetition of the dresses. I love Without Dowry, which is particularly poignant. I swear she's the same lady that we saw in London. And this is The Artist's Wives. And it just seems that he sort of loses his way slightly, or more than slightly, when he loses the love of his wife. The faces become sort of a lot harsher in many ways. Having done The Women of Paris, he decides to do another series on the female traveller. So this is The Embarkation at Calais, also known as The Traveller, and is in the Antwerp collection. And I'm just comparing it down the bottom here to the departure platform, Victoria Station, because I wanted to show you how Mrs. Newton haunted him in death. So this is very clearly the English woman sort of arriving in Paris in 1885. But if you look in the background, there is Mrs. Newton's coat with its very distinctive shawl-like collar. So he really is haunted by her in death. Like Rossetti, he gets involved with spiritualism, Ouija boards, and this is The Apparition of 1885, which has only recently been rediscovered and sold at auction. And Tissot now completely changes. He finds faith, the faith that he had as a young man. He paints this sequence of images known as Tissot's Bible. And this one, What Our Saviour Saw from the Cross, shows you how very unusual they are in terms of their composition, but also how amazingly detailed. So this is, as you can see, the Virgin Mary. This is the Mary Magdalene, and they're at the foot of the cross, and it's him looking out. Gosh, it's very emotive, isn't it? A very emotive image, very powerful. And it's only recently that people have done a lot of work about Tissot once he got back to France and concentrated on painting his Bible. It was nearly the whole set was bought by Brooklyn Museum in New York. It was a huge success in America and through prints and engravings. But he ends his life, it may be sad, but he certainly ends his life in luxury, as you can see here from his studio at the Chateau de Bouillon, which is, I think it's in the Auvergne. It's certainly in the wilds of France. That's the entrance. This is just the entrance gate. That's the chateau. That's his orangery. This is his studio. And here we see him with a group of friends.